Hi, my name is Josie Osika, and today we are going to be talking about adoption. This video is mostly meant for anybody who's trying to process what adoption means for them in their life, whether that be in the past, present, or the future. This might be a good video to watch if you yourself were adopted, or if you're considering adopting children, or maybe you already have adopted children. I'm an anthropologist, so my perspective on some of these issues is going to be a little bit different from what you're used to hearing from social workers, but I think that can add some valuable insight. One topic that I think we often take for granted when it comes to adoption is the idea of family. In America, we have a very specific idea of what the perfect family looks like. You imagine the nuclear family, which is usually two parents, a man and a woman, with their children, maybe 2 or 3 kids. They have a house and a white picket fence, maybe a little dog. But I'm here to tell you that that is not actually what the average family looks like. There's a lot of ways to make a family, and the only reason that we uphold this idea of the nuclear family is because it's what we're used to. To help make this point, I was looking at some census data. In 2021, 10% of all US households have a single parent. In 2014, extended families represented 17% of all households in America. In 2012 to 2016, 10% of all married couple households were interracial or interethnic households. What we picture as the traditional nuclear family, probably white, probably 2 parents, probably straight, isn't actually necessarily normal for a lot of people, and I don't think that that's a problem. There's no real reason why your family has to be normal. Another type of family that we don't necessarily think of when we think of the traditional American family is a family with adopted children in it. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit more about what anthropology specifically has to say about family, so that you can understand more that this typical family that we're taught to strive towards isn't the only way, and it isn't necessarily better or worse than any other family dynamic. In anthropology, a lot of the time we refer to this study of families as kinship studies. We consider a family to be a cluster of people who oftentimes live together and are related by blood or marriage, but the boundaries of what a family even is changes by definition from culture to culture. For example, broadly speaking, you have affinal, consanguinal, and fictive kin. Affinal kin is related to you by marriage, so they're not actually related to you by blood, but they're still considered your family. Next, consanguinal, which can break down into with blood, is anyone who's related to you by blood. This might be your biological siblings or your parents. Lastly, you have fictive kin, which refers to anyone who isn't related to you by blood or marriage. Another dimension to how we study family in anthropology is the kinship structure. This can be matrilineal, patrilineal, bilateral kinship, and it also gets really complicated from there. But basically, we in America tend to have bilateral kinship. This means that as a child, we consider ourselves to be related to both our mother's family and our father's family. But it's not like that in every culture. For example, in some places, you're only considered to really be related to your mother's family and not necessarily your father's family. When we understand these concepts of these different kinds of kin and these different kinship structures as well as marriage practices, you can start to understand that there's a lot of different combinations that you can have of these things, which makes all of these different cultures have a very different idea of family. These different ideas aren't necessarily correct or incorrect because we have no real reason to think that we're right over anyone else. It's just what we're used to. For instance, some people have been opposed to adoption in the past because they think that the adoptive mother wouldn't be the child's real mom. But as we can see all of this variation in kinship around the world, there's no reason why she can't be the child's real mother and why they can't be their parent's real child. Now that we understand a little bit more about the anthropological perspective on family and what a real family is, let's talk about adoption in America. Most people in America have no direct experience with the foster and adoptive system, which means that we get most of our information from the media. A 2017 study, which is linked below, went through a whole bunch of movies that portrayed adoptive or foster children, and they compared what was portrayed in the movies to the reality of the foster and adoptive system. What they found was that in the media, there was a reliance on a racist stereotype of Black women as irresponsible welfare queens, that children portrayed in the movies were predominantly white, between the ages of 6 to 10, had no siblings, and were placed into foster care due to child neglect, And in the media, foster parents were predominantly middle-class white married couples with no children. Comparing these media portrayals to reality, the researchers found that most foster parents are in fact white, but they're low income and they already have children. They also found that over half of US foster children are from minority racial groups, despite the media showing that most children in the system are white. They also found that the media way overrepresented children with disabilities, and in fact, only about 1 in 10 foster children actually have special needs. They also noticed that 1/3 of children in the movie sample ran from foster care to escape abusive conditions, while in reality, less than 1% of children run from their foster placement. In the same fashion, 1/4 of the children in the movie sample experienced foster care abuse, which actually occurs in less than 1% of the foster child population. By watching these movies, a lot of us come out the other end with misconceptions about what it might mean to be a foster child, or what it might mean to be a foster parent, or even to adopt. This can be harmful for children in the system because it can decrease people's likelihood of thinking that maybe adoption is right for them. Now that we have a little bit of background on anthropology and family, as well as adoption in the media in America, let's get into what it actually looks like. As you may or may not know, there's actually a lot of roads to adoption or possible outcomes to the system. The first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people when it comes to adoption is private domestic adoption. Private means that you're working with an agency, and domestic means that you're adopting somebody from your own country. These children are often infants, and it can be a lot easier for parents to find the exact kind of child that they want if they have very specific wants. You can also adopt internationally. Some adoptions are arranged before the child is even born, while others are arranged after. If arrangements for the child's adoption are made after they're born, this can be for a number of reasons. The first may be that it was the mother's plan all along and she's just looking for the right family for her child, or it can be that the biological parent's rights were terminated. If a child is taken away from their biological family for any given reason, the first goal of the system is always to reunite that family. But sometimes that isn't possible and parental rights are completely terminated, in which case that child will either be adopted to a family or they will go into foster care. This means that now the child is in the state's custody. This can happen at a number of ages. Sometimes the child is still an infant, but kids go all the way up to sometimes even past 18 while they're looking for families. Some of these children end up in the foster care system. When they're in foster care, they may end up being adopted by their foster family, or a small amount of children do end up running away, or some children age out of the system. Aging out of the system or running away is not the ideal outcome because then that child doesn't have a support system to fall back on throughout life. Now, let's assume that we're talking about a child who is unable to be adopted by an extended family member, and they're also not able to be reconnected with their birth parents. As a lot of research shows, including the 2016 study by Rayleigh that I again linked below, the most sought after child will be able-bodied with no disabilities, they will be white, and they will be 5 years of age or younger. In reality, however, children of color are overrepresented in the system, and there's also a lot of children with disabilities or children who are a little bit older. A lot of parents have the same preferences, unfortunately, and there's not enough children who fit those preferences for all of the families. According to Rayleigh, in this market, children are stratified by race and parents are sorted by family structure, and the most preferred child characteristics are mostly available in private domestic adoption, not foster or international. You'll notice that research also referenced family structure as a factor that affects what children a family will adopt. For example, same-sex couples are more likely to adopt non-white children. As you can tell, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to adoption, and there's a lot of factors at play. There's also a lot of different people who have specific agendas that they're trying to fulfill. The adoptive parents might want a specific kind of child. There's also price involved or specific laws. There's also the wishes and rights of the birth parents of the child, as well as the role of the state and welfare workers. It's important to recognize when you have power over somebody else so that you're able to respect them and their wishes a little bit more. But it's also important to help you understand maybe when you don't have power so that you can start to work through that and maybe find ways to help your chances. So, as I mentioned, there are multiple parties involved in this adoption process. You have potential adoptive parents, you have biological parents, you have the children, you have the extended biological family, you have the welfare system, and you have the social workers who are working within the welfare system. The first power dynamic that I want to discuss today is about the adoption process itself before the child is solidly adopted into a family. First, let's talk about the dynamic between the state and parents, both biological and adoptive. In both cases, the state has power over these parents. The reason for this is that the state has a way of making these ideas that we have of what a proper family is legal and setting it in stone. This legal naturalization of normative family values are rules that are meant to protect children from mistreatment, but this idea of mistreatment is culturally constructed and can sometimes put particular families in sticky situations. For example, it has been argued that a lot of the time Black or African American children are taken away easier from their families than a white child might be because of America's racist past and the scrutiny that African American families are under. This might be part of why non-white children are disproportionately represented in the American foster and adoption system. Now, the system also has a lot of power over adoptive parents. The interesting thing about this is that most adoptive parents have never actually been involved with the government in this way. They're not used to being part of a welfare system where they're at the mercy of the system. This can lead to a lot of anxiety of not having control over your own life. One study found that both social workers and adoptive parents both feel powerless under the power of the state. While we've already talked about how parents are under the power of the state, social workers also perceive that they are under the power of the state and don't have a lot of wiggle room in how they perform their job under these rules. This is interesting because parents are also at the mercy of social workers a lot of the time. Within this dynamic between the state and parents, there's a very specific hierarchy that most research seems to have a consensus on. The state, or the law, has the most power, next is the social worker, next is adoptive parents, and at the bottom is biological parents. Most of the time, biological parents do not have as much power as other parties involved who are adults. Now, I want to talk about the power dynamic after a child is placed into the family. There's some power dynamics in the home that are at play in most American families, such as parents usually have power over children, or older children have more power over younger children. But it's also important to understand this power dynamic within the context of adoption. A 1988 paper by Ehart and Power states that adoptive families are by definition different from biological families, and therefore set up for failure if they're trying to emulate biological families. This idea of adoptive families being fundamentally different from biological families is very important to what we talked about earlier about the anthropological perspective of adoption. While neither type of family is necessarily right or wrong, they're fundamentally not the same, which is why it's important to talk about adoption and to understand these power dynamics. In the case of a child who may not look like their adoptive family, it's important to recognize that they are adopted and that they're accepted and they are different, but that's not a bad thing. By understanding this level of difference, but also sameness and specialness, it can really alleviate some of the tensions adoptive children can experience throughout their lives. So what does all of this mean together? Unfortunately, I'm not a social worker and I'm not a child welfare professional, so I can't give you specific advice because it's just not my area of expertise. But I do have some ideas and suggestions for you, whatever your position in this power structure may be. First, I really recommend getting a variety of resources to help you navigate this situation. You can start with this video, and then I also have a lot of my sources linked below that are publicly available. I also recommend more public resources or joining support groups. Building a good support system is also really important in this process, and this support system should be both for yourself as maybe a parent or a child, but also for the other people that you are connected to in this system. It also doesn't hurt to be surrounded by people who are empathetic of your situation and understand how much you're going through. Lastly, personally, I'm a huge advocate for therapy for basically everybody. The adoptive system can be very confusing and very difficult for everyone involved. So I think that therapy can be a really good option for people to unpack all of these things that maybe they're not really sure how to feel about them or what to make of them or what to do going forward. Anyway, I hope this video helped you understand your position in the adoptive system, whether that be in hindsight or in the future. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.